My future would be like, I'm getting anything. Well, everyone, in the interest of time, we're going to get started. So I don't think I need to introduce Professor Michael Elliott, right? If I did, I think I'll
That's right.
Anyway, so we're here today to celebrate Michael's 40 plus years of service, teaching, and research at Georgia Tech. He made incredible contributions to University Regional Planning, to College of Design, and Georgia Tech in general. So what we're going to do today is we're going to first hear from him, his acts, and then we're going to have time to share some stories and anecdotes that we have with Michael. So with this, I'm going to pass the stage to Professor Elliott to present his last lecture, although I don't really believe it's going to be his last lecture, but for now, maybe. We'll see.
We'll see.
Okay, go ahead.
I have finished teaching. So we're here for a farewell address. This is not a common Georgia Tech tradition, but I think it should be. I'm particularly interested in giving the address this year because of the particular challenges we face under the new administration. And so I want to gauge the question of what does 40 plus years of academic and 50 plus years of practice tell me about the current situation? How does it provide any insights? And how might it help us think about this situation that we're in? And it also provides a way to give you some sense of what I've been doing for the last 50 years. So the title of the talk, and the way this is set up, as I actually have to turn around to see what my slides say, is Democracy and Disequilibrium. We're going to be looking at planning as a profession. It's going to be centered around the role of discourse as both in politics and in planning, and the need for civic action. The focus will also be on the idea of partisanship as a kind of root cause of the conditions that we find ourselves in. In case you don't know who I am, this is me. I love this photograph. This is my very favorite photograph. All the city in the background, Georgia Tech, and my office of 40 years in the background. So this is my favorite photograph. What we're going to do is first take a look at partisanship and the way in which partisanship has evolved and what its impact is on the current situations of being in planning. We're going to look at three particular impacts in more detail. And the first of these impacts has to do with the role of information and the way we understand the world and some of the divisions around even what constitutes facts and how to, in fact, assess it, which is central to the way planning works. The second is looking at what we call framing, cognitive frames, the way our mind makes sense of the world. And I've done a significant amount of research and in fact, goes back to my dissertation on cognitive frames and the ways in which communities are shaped by those frames. And we'll take a little look at that. The third is the kind of central idea of social capital as a way to move forward. The notion of, in fact, engaging with people whose perspective is different than ours in a way that breaks down some of these barriers and borders that currently exist between us. And finally, we will look at this potential implications for planning and some ideas about how planning might, in fact, engage with some of these processes. Okay, so we start with partisanship. And I think with all of these, we're going to first try to lay out what I see the situation as being, and then kind of look at it historically as to how we got to where we are. This is a kind of Pew Charitable Trust does surveys, lots of surveys, all kinds of surveys. This particular one is on political beliefs and ideology. They've been doing it for a while, and this shows the 1994 condition. 1994 turns out to be a seminal year in partisanship. because we had at that time a Congress that was going through, the Republican Party in the Congress was going through a major transformation in which they had made decisions to, in fact, approach their constituency in a much more conservative way and a much clearer conservative way. And so prior to that, what you found is that the median Democrat and the median Republican really were not very far away from each other. So if we go forward, though, to 2014, we see a significant kind of movement on both sides of the conservative and the progressive sides towards being more consistently either liberal or conservative. Trump gets elected in this environment, and then it looks like this, in which particularly the consistently liberal end increases significantly under Trump's administration. And that makes sense. You find on these surveys, opinion surveys and things like that, that whenever there is a pro-environmental president, environmental concerns drop. And whenever there's a president that doesn't care about environment, for instance, everybody starts worrying about it. And so this reflects that. But the picture is consistent and radically different than what existed in 1994, so 30 years ago. And so this is when we're talking about partisanship, part of it is these sets of attitudes and constituencies that are further and further away from each other. The question partly is, how did we get there? Why did that emerge in 1994 and bring us to the present moment? And partly, what are the current consequences of that? So let's look at the current consequences first. So the current consequences are what I would say are three major issues that as planners and policy people, we're going to have to be able to deal with over this next administration. The first is the effort by the Trump administration to dismantle the federal apparatus that essentially was set up to promote progressive social change. We'll go into some of the details about how that got created, but the dismantling is pretty clear and pretty dramatic. On day one, January 20th, these are the executive orders that he signed, kind of expanding border enforcement, reversing climate change initiatives, renaming things. So that was always fun. And then repealing 67 of Biden's executive orders. And by the way, Biden, during his term, repealed 67 of Trump's executive orders. And I cannot imagine that that number was accidental, that it happened to be just the same, right? So if we put this into perspective, though, how many is 26? This is what they look like over the last administrations. We basically have in the order of 110 to 170 per administration. Trump was up to 220. Biden was in the range. Trump has already given 129 executive orders. I might know that historically, this is actually quite low, that the average since the turn of the 1900s has been somewhere on the order of 650 executive orders by Democratic presidents and per 4-year period, and about 450 by Republicans. And the numbers decreased significantly after 1950s. So that the use of executive power is not new. It's an old tradition. How he's using it, obviously, is much more aggressive than what was done before. The second problem is this idea of the language we're using and the values in which the administration is moving against. So these are all words. Oh, it disappeared. Let me bring that back. They're lovely to watch and stroll. All of those words are banned by federal agencies. Okay, so this is a kind of effort to change a culture fairly directly, and to do it starting with the, kind of with the federal agencies, but in fact, to move beyond that and to move into states and other institutions with the same kind of pressure. So this is related to the third aspect that I would identify, which is the effort to concentrate power in the executive branch, not only in opposition to the states, governors, and the kind of local governance, but also in reference to institutions such as universities and markets. And you see this kind of effort to dominate the question, of course, will be how effective he will be, but it's clearly part of the effort itself. So in this context, the question is how anomalous is this? How different is this kind of action? And what we'll see is that the struggle between conservatives and liberals or progressives in the United States has very deep roots. There has really been very few times when there hasn't been a substantial struggle between those two perspectives on how the world ought to be, and particularly how the United States ought to be. I put Don Schoen up. I don't know who reads Don Schoen anymore, but that's all good, all the theory people. Don Schoen, I put him up because I started in planning in 1971, my first class, 1971, which is when Beyond the Stable State came out, and he was teaching at MIT. So one of the seminal ideas that I started planning with is we really do not have stability in our system. And I like this quote, which is, "Belief in the stable state serves primarily to protect us from the apprehension of the threats inherent in change." That really what we are is always in flux. And the question is, how do we manage that flux? And planning has to be able to manage those kinds of change and that kind of flux. If it can't, then it is a profession that is going to not have answers to the current conditions, right? So in this context, what kind of state did we find ourselves in 1971 and going forward? So one of the things that I'd like this particular kind of from Martin Luther King, right? It says, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It's a quote that I presume most of you have heard. It is a claim to stability, right? It is a claim that the world has a certain order, and that order is one of a moral universe. I might note that Martin Luther King was not the first to say this, that there was a predecessor, I'm forgetting his name right now, who in 1858, as an abolitionist and a transcendental philosopher, said essentially the same thing. That in the case, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, that's a long bend, a long arc, right? Going back that far. And we forget. So one of the advantages of being my age is I have lived a lot of this history, things that you think of as history. And I remember in a class once I was talking to my students, and I said, "Well, do you remember this?" And they raised their hand and they said, "We weren't born then." At which point I realized, okay, I'm in history, right? But the years that I grew up in the 50s and 60s looked like this, right? So we had, first of all, Little Rock, a Supreme Court decision. I might note that Supreme Court that issued that decision unanimously, 100% of the people on that court were appointed by Democrats, right? So Roosevelt was in office so long, and Truman afterwards had appointed 3 of them. So we had a liberal court, the most liberal court we've ever had, because Democrats had dominated for so long. And what we're seeing now, of course, is the reversal of that, right? So the Birmingham and what was happening in Birmingham, which I presume, but that's what was happening in universities. I put University of Utah up there because I think most of us think all of this was happening in Ivy League schools. This was a protest at the University of Utah, which is about as conservative a place as you can be. So you had disruption at that level. You had all kinds of social movements, right? So you had the civil rights movement, you had the environmental movement, the kind of women's movement, the feminist movement, and the anti-war movement, all of those things fomenting during a decade. You also had a counter to that, right? I mean, it was not that the conservatives went away. It's that they didn't have voice. And I specifically am interested in this question of they didn't have voice because at that time, the technology of communication was largely driven by newspapers and by television. And there were three dominant networks. You had a consensus amongst most of the people that were in the journalism field about what constituted normal behavior. And conservatives didn't fit that. And in fact, when you saw articles in the newspaper about conservatives, they tended to be the really extreme parts of conservatism. And yet, when you looked at Wallace or Goldwater running for president, the fact that they won, well, Goldwater won the Republican Party's nomination, got demolished in the actual election. Wallace was running as an independent, and did not win, but won substantial percentages of populations, right? And the other piece of this, in their loss and in the ascendancy of the kind of progressives' kind of take on politics during that period of time, you saw the strengthening, either the emergence or the strengthening of a whole series of think tanks that are associated with conservative thought. The most prominent of which is Heritage Foundation, which was started in 1973 in reaction to the changes that had taken place. Heritage Foundation is the organization that produced Project 2025. I might note that while we probably only heard about it this time, that every 4 years they produce what they call mandates for leadership. So this is not new. This has been happening for a couple of decades that these are being produced. What's new is that the president-elect so clearly was going to, in fact, try to implement it, right? And so the direct association with the conservative movement. But there were other conservative think tanks, the American Enterprise and the Hoover Institution, the Cato Institution, which is more libertarian than the others. All of these kind of locations for intellectual thought about the development of conservative ideas have been, in fact, being developed over the last 40, 50 years. In this context, we also see some images that strike us as being familiar, having to do with South and desegregation. But the image to the left is less clear. That is in Boston, okay? And it was an anti-busing kind of demonstration. And you saw that the kind of rising racial animism that occurred across the United States during this particular period of time. This is a kind of the construction worker demonstration around an issue having to do with decreasing highway construction and anger over the loss of jobs related to producing fewer highways and more transit instead. 1964, that image was. We also, of course, saw during this decade the death of three substantial leaders, kind of central leaders, thought provokers, people who created change around issues of race in particular, but around lots of other issues as well, and through assassination. So this is a very turbulent decade. What we're experiencing now is not yet at this level, and the fear is that it might get to be at this level, but it is certainly not there yet, right? Kent State, in which 4 students were killed in protests, is a substantially higher level of violence than what we're experiencing now. And yet, the second most conservative president during this period of time was elected, and that's Nixon, for being in office for 4 years. And so he's elected in 1972, despite all of this that's going on. The issue is when Nixon, one of the striking things, of course, is that when Nixon was, I don't know, accused is not the right word, but when he was investigated, there was a substantial difference in the institutions that bound him. So Nixon and Trump strike me as being very similar in perspective in terms of how they think about concentrating power, their ability to do whatever they want, and other kinds of things like that. The difference is that, for instance, there was much less partisanship during this period of time. And so condemnation of Nixon was not restricted to Democrats. It was also widely present in the Republican Party itself. The impeachment procedures very likely would have succeeded. And if we think about what the issue was that caused that, he broke into he didn't himself, but broke into an office and stole something, right? That, by today's standards, would probably be considered pretty mild. It's hard to imagine anybody getting impeached over something like that. So things have clearly changed in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of the moral boundaries around which we give civic responsibility to people like our presidents. And so in this context, one of the ways of looking at this, and it's kind of interesting, is why did the partisanship strengthen so much starting in the 1990s? And this is a kind of chart that shows the dominant. So if it's in deep color, it means that all branches of government are controlled by the same party. And what we see is pretty much Republican control up until the Depression, pretty much Democratic control from the Depression all the way up until the 1990s, with the president starting to shift a lot more back and forth. And then this kind of back and forth format since the 1990s, where you have a president, they have a majority in both houses for 2 years, they then lose it, and then can't get anything else done. And then the next time there's an election, it turns out to be a different party, right? So clearly the United States is of mixed minds about what it wants from this national politics. It does not have a settled consensus either way. And yet what we've seen is that the politics of the parties themselves, the participants, the constituents of each party have moved further and further away from each other. So we have a country that can't make up its mind between them, and 2 parties that keep on getting further and further apart. This is a recipe for, on the one hand, potentially non-action, inaction, being kind of caught. On the other hand, it's also a recipe for somebody who's willing to push past the usual boundaries to create fairly significant change based on whatever that perspective is from. And in this particular case, what we're talking about is a president who believes in conservative perspectives. And we're seeing that push take place. So that obviously is unstable. This whole situation is unstable. The question is how it will resolve itself, because it will eventually resolve itself, right? And the fear is that it will resolve itself in a way that moves us back to conservative ideas that have no real room for local governance, state governance, federal governance to be active in trying to resolve some of the problems we think are important. So in this context, the question is, how does planning deal with this? You know, what insights does my own work have in trying to think through how to respond to the situations. So I start with, of course, that we really are talking about three things leading to another thing. And the thing that it leads to is this notion of action. That planning differs from the social sciences because it is a profession that seeks to change the world. And so what we're doing then is incorporating and engaging, first of all, this question of goals, of what the society ought to be doing, how we should know what it ought to be doing, and how do we move towards making that central to policymaking. And secondly, we deal with this idea of knowledge, that we have kind of social sciences, other kinds of sciences. We have knowledge at different levels, and how do we engage the question of knowledge? And then third, we have this idea that there's something called planning, which is largely a process, a way of engaging certain kinds of questions, many of which are community-based or spatial, and doing so in a way that allows decisions, good decisions, hopefully, to be made and to be implemented, that lead to action that actually implements them. So we're going to be going through each of these and saying, well, how do we think about this in this context of a high degree of partisanship? So what we've been looking at so far is this context, right? All of this has to respond to a context. If the political system changes, so does the strategies, right? They need to respond to it. But it's also true that the issues, as the issues change, we're constantly adapting. It's one of the things that I've actually loved very much about being a planner, that it's been 50 years of constantly reinventing myself. I mean, I didn't have to change professions. And for 40 years, I didn't have to change jobs, but I got to do all these different kinds of things because that's the nature of planning, right? That there's all these challenges, and how we engage those challenges are going to shape us, but also give us a sense of accomplishment. And so I would say for the young planners, the planners who are still in school, this is the wonderful thing about being in planning. But the flip side of it is that it's also constantly challenging you. You're always having to reconsider and recenter yourself in the context of political systems that keep on changing like this, right? Okay, so let's start by looking at, assuming I can get this to work, the kind of three different ideas that I wanted to explore. So the first of these is this idea that society is increasingly unable to agree on standards for what constitutes facts and how to assess them, and how to do so in a way that makes sense of their import and their impact. So this is a pretty fundamental question for planning. You can't really do planning unless you can do this. Now, planners have always struggled with this to some degree, because even when we believed in rational planning, we were always trying to convince people that we knew what we were doing and made sense of the world, and people didn't believe us. So we always had this kind of issue, and it's not just a communication issue. It's a fundamental question of what constitutes good practice in terms of understanding the world, right? And so I'm going to start with the fact that where planning actually emerged out of. Now, planning has older roots than this, and architecture and other kinds of things, but it really was modernism that shaped modern planning. Modernism, so Le Corbusier, this image, if you don't know what this image is, does anybody know where this is? Not just France, Paris. It's in central Paris. This idea that old architecture ought to be swept away, right? That the world had changed, and that what we needed is a new form of architecture and urban design and urbanism that reflected the modern world. And there was a number of conditions, but this kind of notion that modern town planning comes to birth with a new architecture by this immense step of evolution, so brutal, so overwhelming. We burn our bridges and break with the past. And there's a whole series of things I'm not going to go into with associated with this, except to say that if you think about Paris now, if you've ever been there, and you think about this image, clearly we have changed our mind and disagree with this. But this idea of modernism had enormous impact. And some of the impact was, of course, on the architecture. If you look at urban renewal through the 50s, 60s, and you look at public housing in the United States during that period, it looks like this, right? And so it clearly had an effect on urbanism. It also has an effect on how we think about the world and what constitutes facts in the world. It says that, in fact, that there's a dominant idea, and that dominant idea is correct, right? That the other ideas should be swept away, right? And gives a kind of absolutist idea about how planners should, in fact, think of the world. It links to the development of our ideas about rational planning and other kinds of ideas as well. In this context, of course, he gets a lot of pushback in the 1960s. Some of this, the probably most famous person related to this was Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs gets in a fight with Robert Moses. Robert Moses was probably the most famous planner in the United States at that time. He displaced, the older generation of planners that Burnham in particular, that thought of urban design as the center of planning. And his big take on the world is that you need authority in order to impose infrastructure onto places in an efficient way, right? So it gets into this fight about putting a highway through Manhattan. If you've been to Manhattan, you cannot try to imagine what a highway through that would look like. So we have this social struggle that's going on, and a struggle for ideas. And then I would also add to that the urban villager, who's a sociologist. Herbert Gans is a sociologist. Herbert Gans lived for a period of time in the West End of Boston, right before the government of Boston, the mayor's office of Boston, decided that the West End was a slum, and demolished it all and turned it into housing for middle and upper class, and government offices and skyscrapers for corporations. And his book was basically a study of the kind of community that existed in this place, which turned out to be incredibly robust, right? And so we raise these whole questions of, well, what are these top-down kinds of things doing, right, as a way of doing it? But it's important to sort of situate planning in the sense that we were confident we had the answers, right, until these disruptions started taking place. So in this context, we have not just the social movements that are going on, but we also have intellectuals, theorists who are raising questions about just the whole project of having planning understand or think it understands enough to impose solutions on communities. And in this context, the Rittel and Weber, Dilemmas on a General Theory of Planning, it turns out that I learned my planning theory from Rittel and Weber, because they were at the University of California in Berkeley, which is where I did my theory work. And so, you get this sense of there are contextual issues. I'm not going to go, again, there's 10 principles associated with this, but it's important to just understand that there are problems that have a context. All problems have context. All problems fit in systems, and the systems are either simple or complicated. And all problems are about people, hopefully. You don't have problems that don't have any people in it anywhere. So there are communities associated with these problems. And many engineering problems look like this. The gray that's in there, they are low with people, they are low with context, they are moderately high with complexity, but not very much about ambiguity because they have very clear outcomes that are desired. Social problems don't look like that. Social problems look like this, right? Where they are high in intractability, high in diversity, high in complexity, ambiguity. They are unstable. They have lots of constraints. And under those conditions, you cannot optimize because you cannot, in fact, make decisions that are consistent with a single public purpose, which doesn't actually represent the community that it's supposed to represent, right? So in this context, there are kind of a postmodern critique that emerges in planning. That postmodern critique basically argues that knowledge is not objective, that knowledge emerges out of a social context and is constructed in that social context, and that reality lacks an internal logic that can be used to create these rational planning models. It's important. So this postmodern movement occurs in almost all professions during this time. I might note that planning was particularly good at absorbing postmodernity. If you look at anthropology, for instance, or even architecture, their professions were very much more disrupted during this period. But planning actually planners were in fact open to these ideas, that in fact local knowledge would be of importance and that you had to search and understand in community, not just from a kind of social science perspective. So we adapted to these ideas fairly well. But I want us to note that these ideas also lead to the current situation we are in, right? The question is, we look at Trump and we say, he's lying. He's saying things that are not true, right? And yet, half of the population, maybe not that many, but a significant amount, believe that what he's saying is true, and that what Witt is saying are not. If you believe that truth is local, that it's constructed socially, then you end up in a situation where the social construction of truth in the conservative movement potentially has the same validity as social construction in the progressive movement. So in that context, it was the progressives who created these ideas about how to think about knowledge and truth that then created something that, or at least finds itself reflected in something that we strongly disagree with, right? The question is, how do you deal with that? If in fact knowledge is local, if it's created, socially constructed, then in some way it requires a social reconstruction to create a society in which there is agreement about facts. So we can no longer rely on authority, pure authority, to define what those facts are. We did religion for many thousands of years. We did science for a much shorter period of time, but science was in fact for a period of time the dominant way of understanding what facts are. What does the future of facts mean? How do we think about it? And almost certainly the question is not, can a single profession create these facts, like the church or the temple or the scientists, but rather, how do we as a society create and try to understand shared facts? So that's the kind of tension that we find ourselves in. In this, okay? Let's see if it works that way. It works that way, okay. In this, I wanted to sort of point out a couple of other things about the changing and evolving relationship with the federal government. And I want to focus on, first of all, if you look at these, this is as a percentage of federal outlays, all money spent by the federal government. How much goes to transportation, how much to natural resources, and how much to community and regional development. And what we see in the blue square is the very rapid increase for the interstate highway system. So we had a president, Eisenhower, Republican, who believed in, largely because he was a general and he saw how Germany used its highway system during war, and it was actually part of the defense appropriations to begin with, that to create an interstate system for the movement of troops around the United States. But enormous amounts of money going into that system of highways, right? No real conception of what this was going to do to cities at that time, but lots of investment. And the one in kind of red, I find more interesting, right? Because the red is, you see a slight uptake in terms of natural resources environment, but in fact, it comes nowhere near what we were doing before and during World War II. The really big one is the community and regional development. So we see this very rapid increase in the amount of money the federal government is spending on it. And by the way, the federal government is not spending it directly, it's giving it to localities. The consequence for planning was quite significant because the planning at that time had largely been local and largely under-resourced. And all of this money flowed into localities through planning organizations, that you couldn't get this money unless you had planners, and the planners had plans for doing the things that this money could do. And so suddenly it turned out that planning agencies were in fact highly desirable by local governments. Couple of things happened. This is really, okay, there it goes. This is just a redoing of it, but the thing that's most prominent was this. Categorical grants are grants that the federal government gave to local governments, except you had to apply for them. So you couldn't get the money except with an application, which meant that in order to apply, you had to have a planner. So the planning profession exploded during this time. We went from, I actually had these numbers written down, but I don't, so hopefully I remember them right, somewhere on the order of 34 planning schools in the United States in the beginning of this period, or even less than that, like 24, to almost triple that number. And that was all because of this. Now, this has another effect besides making planners popular in cities and giving them jobs. The other effect is that this was under a progressive administration. So the only way you could get money from the federal government to do these kinds of things is if you had a progressive project to do. So transit or affordable housing or any number of other things that you could apply for. So there was this allyship between the federal government and the local governments during this time. So when the conservatives talk about the deep state, this is the kind of thing that they're talking about, right? These kinds of structures that get built in order to change state and localities, because this was very explicitly designed to make, for instance, cities more environmentally safe, to make them easier in accessibility, to change the education systems, to do things like that. And so the other piece of this, of course, is not just the going up, but the coming down. And that's under the Reagan administration, that in fact, its impact on the planning profession was limited to about a 15 or 20-year period. And then planning struggled for years in what we called, I'm actually forgetting the name. There was a name for, do you remember what the name is? It was kind of, it wasn't cutback planning, but it was something like that.
Talking about planning under austerity.
Yeah, well, there's lots of words for the different versions of this. This is what we were doing under not just Reagan, but moving forward. How do you do planning when you don't have all of these resources? So in this context, I'm going to go back to Don Schoen, except I'm going to make him a little older because he would be older when he did this, and make him more look like me. And he writes The Reflective Practitioner, right? He says there's a high, hard ground where practitioners can make effective use of research-based theory and technique And there's a swampy lowland where situations are confusing messes, incapable of technical solution. In the swamp are the problems of greatest human concern. So that what we have is a kind of notion, well, we're going to have to struggle through this. How do we do that, right? And so there's he and Schoen and other theorists basically start to think about how do society, the social structures, learn, right? How do they make mistakes, because they're always going to make mistakes, but don't keep on repeating the same mistake, but actually learn and develop this idea of what's called reflective practice. The idea that really good practitioners are ones that have an espoused theory, but also have a theory in practice and engage in these questions consistently, right? And so the idea is to go beyond what's called single loop learning, not just to look at the outcome and then say, oh, the action strategy worked or didn't work, but rather to go back through double loop learning to the reasoning that went behind the assumptions that then led to the strategies, right? And that takes a large amount of discipline. It also takes the capacity to hear voices outside of yourself. You cannot by yourself examine your own actions objectively, right? So you need other people to help you understand what you did and how you did it, and you need to be open to that kind of action. So this leads us to the second kind of set of ideas around planning. The idea is that the kind of cognitive value and cultural frames that accentuate these perceptual divergences are in fact related to cognitive frames and have implications for decision-making, public decision-making, that are important. So we're going to look at goals and knowledge together, and we're going to look at this in reference to what we call frames. So frames are abstractions that we have, they're perceptions, and we use them to define a situation we find ourselves in. The world is too complex, we have to simplify it. We use these kind of cognitive tricks to simplify the world. And they are fairly persistent and consistent. So my dissertation is based on some ideas around these frames around risk perceptions. Much of the work that I did in research since then have been looking at other kinds of frames as well, and the ways in which they shape conflict in particular, but political process in general, right? So in this context, the one that I find most interesting is the idea of social control frames. And social control frames kind of say that people make sense of their world, both in terms of their ability to impact it and in terms of the interdependence, the way they think about the social society itself. How interdependent is it? And so there are people who, for instance, don't think that there's much independence in society. Society is just made up of a bunch of individuals, and there's low impact on it. So they're fatalists. They basically think that, well, what's going to happen is going to happen, and we don't have a lot of control over it, and neither does society, right? Now, if society has a lot of control over it and you have very little, this kind of hierarchy, think church, right, as a structure. And if you have high ownership, but society has low, then it's really about being individualist, about having a perspective that you have to be self-sufficient, you have to be able to make it work, you have to be able to pull it together, and hard work will get you as far as you can go, right? And then, of course, the high on each is egalitarian. Now, progressives tend to think of themselves as egalitarian. They tend to think that society interdependence is important and that they have an impact. And on the other hand, if you look at the policies that come out of that, they often are quite hierarchical. We use regulation a lot. We use other kinds of tools that you would use if, in fact, you were thinking society was, in fact, hierarchical. The conservatives, on the other hand, tend to think of themselves as individuals, as individualistic. On the other hand, they also tend to, when they're in power, use power in a much more hierarchical way. So we have this overlap in terms of how we use power, but very different kind of perspectives on the role of society as it's being kind of in terms of the creation of change over time. So my sense is that progressives have been largely creating policy for a long time, and the reaction of conservatives is both to object very much to the way it was done and to do exactly what we did as well, except further, right? So that you have this kind of tension. And in fact, social control frames, when you talk to people, they don't change that much. I might note that I did a study of frames, not just social control frames, but a whole series of frames with people that I had worked with for 10 years. They were in the city of Chattanooga. I'll get a little bit to that. They were in the city of Chattanooga, and they were kind of a poor African-American community working with around toxics issues with chemical manufacturers. And after 10 years of being able to work together, I mean, it wasn't that they weren't effective at kind of dealing with issues. Their frames, as far as I could tell, had not changed hardly at all. So these are fixed. The issue is you can act even when you have differences in frames, but if your purpose is to convince the other person about your rightness, that's not likely to happen, right? So you have to be able to create social structures that can work with these differences. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through these. We also, the identity and characterization frames, I think, have a huge impact on what's going on now. Identity has to do with who I am, and characterization is, well, who's the other person? They're usually related to each other in some kind of way. And there are obvious identities, such as place-based identities, value-based identities, interest, ethnicity, those kinds of identities. The ones I find more interesting are the ones that are around social drama. What's your role, and it's related to social control. What's your role in society? How do you see yourself? Are you a proponent? Are you an activist? Are you a victim? And then people who take on roles that are not their personal role, but are related to something else they're doing, an institution that they belong to, and the effect that that has as well. So these things are going to shape and simplify the way people engage these questions. And that means that, in fact, the core issues are never addressed because the conversations never can get past what the frames are. So if, in fact, you are going to be able to get through this, you either have to be able to take action independent of frames, or the conversation, the discourse has to get deeper than anything that we have done in the past. So in this context, we can think of the kind of relationships between the problem definition and outcomes, the kind of identity and characterization frames, risks, social identity, conflict management frames, all contributing to intractability and the inability of society to kind of engage and find a balance. Okay, so the third area is the kind of notion that social capital needs to be part of the solution going forward. That we have created a society which is highly fractionated, highly divided. It's increasingly fractionated and divided. We do not have a consensus about one being more powerful than the other, except in short periods of time. And we find excess when, in fact, we go into each shift. That we're undoing what the last one did in order to do something else that will then get undone. So that highly disruptive society, social capital is in fact going to be necessary. So we're going to focus on that question. For those of you who know my work, it's not at all surprising that I think that the kind of communicative rationality has to, in fact, be central to how we move forward. I do work as a dispute resolver. I actually mediate conflicts, but I also do work in kind of building the theory and research related to that as well. And so what we're trying to do is mobilize the creative and kind of self-empowered capacities of communities. There's a need to take communities more seriously, not as individuals who want to say something, but as a group of individuals who need to be able to work together to move forward, right, as a community. And that planner's role is to, in fact, facilitate that in a fairly significant way. I tend to think of these processes as definitively not linear. They are processes that require interaction. They are about creating, generating options, about examining things, and doing it iteratively, because it is in the iteration that people understand their needs and interests more deeply. And it is in the iteration that they also understand what the impact of the options are. And so that we're talking about is creating structures that are much more serious about civic engagement than exists today, for the most part. I want to give you an example. Quickly go through the city of Chattanooga. Anyone who's taken a class from me knows that I love Chattanooga. Chattanooga is a pretty amazing city. In 1969, during my lifetime, this is Chattanooga. If you've been to Chattanooga, it's not Chattanooga anymore. The question is, how do you go from that to something completely different, right? And the Chattanooga of this period was an industrial city. It was like Flint, Michigan, right? And so in this context, it was also in a valley. And so the air pollution was terrible. It was literally declared the worst polluted city in the United States the year before EPA was started. And so this is what downtown looks like, the kind of falling apart, buildings being abandoned, and not any connection to the river at all kind of place. So the question is, how do you build civic capacity in a city? So this is an example of how you build it, the best that I know. So you start in 1981 with, of course, universities. That's how, it's a great thing to start it with. Urban design professor, Stroud Watson, from University of Tennessee in Knoxville, decides to make Chattanooga the base of his future projects, always has students there, right? And creates a center, the Center of Riverfront Downtown Planning and Design Center, which has a fancy name for a abandoned retail space that's heated with a wood stove during winter, that the students are hanging out in and engaging questions. But in a city that's falling apart, it's more active than the city planning, right? City planning is not part of this picture at all, surprisingly. Other kinds of planning are, but not city planning. And so they start conversations, right? The other thing that's of importance about a year later is the task force that gets created. So Marcus and Ben is, if you look at it, it's hard to see from this picture, but that is shaped like a foot. And so it's called Marcus and Ben. That's mostly in state or local government control. The mayor wants to know, what are we going to do with this? He appoints a task force, and the task force does something rather unusual, which is it says, oh, the task isn't big enough. Right? No task force does it, but they did. They said, really, the issue is not what are we going to do with that space. The issue is, what do we do with the 30, 40 miles of river that goes through the city? And they go to Indianapolis to learn. So the first thing is a learning organization, is you go elsewhere and find successes and find out how they organize themselves and start to do that. And they bring back a process for doing the entire river, and which requires them to have 65 different meetings. Now, this is why nobody ever increases what the task is. So, but they're starting to develop a social capacity, right? The next thing that happens is in 1984, a nonprofit is formed. It's called Chattanooga Venture. There's a foundation, Lyndhurst Foundation, that provides the seed money to this. The reason they provided the seed money to this is because they're saying, oh, we're putting all this money into museums and schools, things like that. The city's falling apart. What good is the museum going to do if the city falls apart? Now, most foundations don't do that either. They don't actually think, oh, this problem isn't big enough. We need a bigger problem. And they decided that the model for moving forward was by building social capital. Okay, so that it was about building this social capital. And they were going to do it through this organization called Chattanooga Venture. And so they started with a board of 60 individuals. And if you've ever been on a board, usually it's 7, 10. If it gets to 12, you have all kinds of fights. You get to 60, it's crazy. Now, the reason they did that is because what they wanted to do is incorporate into the board all the different perspectives from the city of Chattanooga. And so you needed 60. And they said, if we can't handle 60, how are we going to handle 150,000, right? So that's the start of that. They go out, they hire planners. There's more planners in Chattanooga Venture than there were in the city at this time. Those planners are skilled facilitators. Not a single planner facilitates a meeting. They train people in the community to facilitate the meetings. People in a particular neighborhood will be trained to facilitate in that neighborhood. They hold meetings in neighborhoods all across the city, and 1,700 people show up of 150,000, which doesn't sound like much, except it constitutes about 5% of all the households, which is actually quite remarkable. In this context, they then generate all these ideas. They bring it back to the city as a whole. Again, not the government, but the process in which anyone who had participated in any of these shows up and talks about what the overlaps and differences are. They send it back to the neighborhood. They bring it back to the city. Does this a couple of times. They end up with a very weird thing. I have to say, as a planner, when I first heard this, I thought, this is not going to go anywhere. And that is a portfolio of 40 consensus goals and 223 projects, none of them prioritized. And you just go, what a mess. Except it's a social capital model. It's not a kind of analytic model. Social capital model says people care about these things, or they wouldn't have gotten onto this list. What we have to do is activate that concern. And so the role of Chattanooga Venture was not to implement anything, but rather to find people who are interested in each of these projects, link them up with other people, train them on how to work effectively together, help them make connections, and then set them on their way. So this is about activating citizen strength in a community. How did that work? These are some of the projects. 223, by the way, 85% of them within 10 years were substantially completed or completed. 85%. They had to go back and do another vision process because they ran out of things to do. Again, more work. These are what we're talking about. Now, obviously, not all of these got completed in the 10 years, like the Riverwalk. The Riverwalk is the entire length of the river. It's enormous. The aquarium was built. And if you've ever been to that aquarium, it's very unique. One of the things, I mean, it's very unique because it's fresh water, but the other thing that's very unique is there's no place to eat in the aquarium. It's the only museum I know of that does not have a place to eat in it. The reason is because it's meant to activate downtown, and to activate downtown means to get people out and into downtown. And everything about this design was designed to do that, right? Every project has multiple outcomes. The Walnut Street Bridge, that bridge there, obviously old, obviously been there a while. State government, the Department of Transportation, had decommissioned it as a state highway, was going to tear it down, already had the money to tear it down at the start of the project. This project took the longest because they had to convince the state to give them the money and the bridge and to basically wipe their hands of it. That took 10 years. So obviously some things are difficult to deal with. Electric shuttle. They decided we're a polluted area. We should have electric shuttles. Let's go buy one. Germany, why do we have to buy one from Germany? Let's start our own company to build electric shuttles so that we can provide electric shuttles to our community. And they did. They built them themselves. There are, of course, lots of other projects. The most significant being Chattanooga Neighborhood Enterprise. This organization built 5,800 affordable housing units. The city of Atlanta has spent 20 plus years trying to build less than that on the Beltline and has not succeeded yet. They did that in about 7 or 8 years. The South Side Project, 380 acres. Atlantic Station is 110 by comparison. That whole area is 110, 3 times as big. And that got redeveloped. All of these things are enormous projects. And I might note the creativity necessary. For instance, how do you start something that's 380 acres? The way they started is they said, what's the biggest reason why people do not live downtown? The biggest reason was, any idea? No. Schools. Schools are not good. No family is going to move downtown unless the schools are good. They built 2 charter schools. They convinced the school department to build 2 charter schools there before anything else got built. The priority being anyone who lives in this community gets first dibs at the charter school. Anyone who works downtown gets second dib. Everybody else is on the third. And so they make it highly desirable in that kind of way. That kind of creativity does not come from planners sitting down and drawing things, right? So this is what Chattanooga looks like kind of now. There's a kind of lots of other processes. They carry it. I might note that the interesting thing about this, the next revision process where they had to go back and redo it, they trained 150 facilitators this time and had twice as many participants, right? These are kind of different, United Nations, 12, Habitat 2. There were 12 cities internationally chosen as example cities, best practice cities. Chattanooga was one of them, right? Because it was of the social capital. It's what drove the whole thing. And others as well. I might say that I worked 10 years in that yellow area, the Yellow Star area, which is kind of surrounded by mountains and looks like this with all these large chemical manufacturing facilities. And one of the really interesting things is can you take these kinds of processes and bring them into disadvantaged communities or communities that do not, in fact, have within themselves the resources to do this kind of work. And what's interesting is that 1/3 of the people who participated in this for over a 10-year period did not live in the community, did not work in the community, not associated with any of the chemical firms, but thought that this ought to be dealt with, right? So there were people associated with emergency management or environmental protection or wanted stream cleanup or any number of other things who participated because they already had a social culture of participating and saw the advantage of doing this. You build social capital over time by showing success in relationship to its use. Can you scale this up? America Speaks is an organization. This chart over here has 4,500 people participating at exactly the same time, having to do with the redesign of the World Trade Center, right? Down here, the notion of the unified New Orleans plan. New Orleans had come through Katrina, and they had gone through 3 planning processes, all of which got rejected because they were insensitive to community concerns. This process occurred in over 20 cities simultaneously. This is what you can do with these kinds of processes now with technological supports, right? In this context, the question will also be, can you take it to these kinds of processes to in essence, the poorest of the poor? The work I did in India for 5-6 years was around kind of engaging questions in informal settlements of increasing the capacity of those settlements to do work and improvements around climate change. They started off with 0 understanding of climate change. And by the end, were able to take effective action and had the resources necessary to do that in over 100 slums. That sounds like a lot, except that's 25,000 individuals of something like 150 million individuals that live in that situation. So still unclear what that might look like. So in this, what we were looking, of course, these are the principles that were driving us. Is it sustainable? Is it transformative? Can it be done hyperlocal? Can it be done by people in the community itself? And so that we end up with kind of looking at how you enhance social capital, understanding, capacity, things like that, building technical capacity at the level that's appropriate and having models for how to do that, that can be shared from one community to another community, bringing in resources for that, and then changing behaviors through these processes of social construction. Okay, so what are some of the implications? How might we be thinking about doing this? We have some sense we can scale up. We have some sense of what the difficulties will be. It is not easy to do this kind of work, but what might it look like? And I just want to say that it will take a it has to deal with three different dimensions that if you're going to deal with. We're talking about cities and regions because it's planning. You have one issue about how is the processes? What's the organizational form? Or is it ad hoc? Is it institutionalized? The scale of the impact, is it local or is it regional? And the degree of collaboration, is it low or is it high? And I just want to say that we can think about this in terms of structures that we can create, governmental structures. We can think about this in terms of processes that we can get created. And we can think about this in terms of networks that get created. And I'm not going to go through all the details of this, except to say that all of these range in terms of these three dimensions that we were talking about. And you need a mix. I mean, anything that's going to have vibrancy needs redundancy at some level. And these are just some examples of what they look like. So structural approaches are kind of systems of governments and regional governance and how that actually works. Issues of processes are interventions that are done in order to solve particular problems. And so, historic preservation comes up as an issue. You design a process and you engage, and you then come up with a set of solutions that work for the city that you're in. And same with other kinds of things. The days of dialogues in Los Angeles and New York were quite interesting in terms of their impact. And then in terms of the network systems, these are loosely constructed networks, but which are supported as networks. And the most famous of these is the CalFed process in San Francisco Bay, largely because Judith Innes writes about it for 20 years. So anyone who reads any of that stuff would know about that. So all of these things together are kind of ideas about how you would in fact move forward. It is going to occur at the local or regional level. And I think for the next 4 years, we have to assume that's where the action is going to be. And if we're going to sustain change over time, that's where we have to start intervening or increase it. What we end up with is, if we think of the 1890s to 1930s as a progressive movement, the question is what's the movement now? Right? What are we creating now in terms of governmental institutions and structures and processes that will enable us to move forward? And what are the challenges? And the challenges are about the fact that we have 140 different jurisdictions in the metropolitan Atlanta area and no real structure for making sense of that and getting society to, or the different governances to interact. I might note that the problem, because I didn't really say this, but one of the problems during the 60s and 70s was suburbanization, right? And where people who did not want to deal with the issues of cities left. And they left in order not to have to deal with the problems of cities. And they are resistant to the problems of cities as they see it, right? And so regional work is not easy work because we have institutionalized the separation of ideas, right? And then collaborative systems for how one does this, how one connects it, and deliberate democracy and networks necessary. So that brings us to the end. What Georgia Tech looks like after I'm gone, right? No longer my face in the picture. So I will, I remember one of the farewell addresses that I liked the most was and some of you have undoubtedly seen it, as President Obama's last press, I'm forgetting what that is called. It's every annual press kind of conference. It's not a conference. It's a it's a correspondence, yeah, of course. So that and he ends it by taking the microphone and dropping it and saying over and out. So over and out. Now, on that note, not such a bad way to start the tradition of people giving farewell addresses. So, we have exactly what happened next. I'm not sure. Someone will tell us.
Maybe we can, if there are any questions or comments about the presentation, we can take those first, a few, but then maybe we can all go ahead and, share a few moments, memories about you.
Oh dear.
First about the presentation.
Yes.
I had a question about how you're bringing us back to this idea of like regional capacity and governance and the ability to make change at that level, and also the challenges. So having worked at an MPO, I feel that I have some inside knowledge in terms of the limitations and the constraints that MPOs have. Obviously, it's just n equals 1. I've only worked at one MPO. And I wonder if you can share a little bit more about how we might be able to bring each into that regional structure so that we bring these different jurisdictions together, because what Boston cares about can often conflict with what Cambridge cares about. And that's where we run into regional issues such as public transportation and regional housing, because it's not going to be solved by just one municipality building more housing.
Yeah. So first of all, I put it in the context of the progressive movement. So the context is one in which a substantial change was likely to be needed, right? Secondly, there's only one elected body, regional planning organization in the United States, which is Portland, which is why you always hear about Portland. The chances of another one in the foreseeable future is zilch, because Portland's was created when there were really no suburbs to resist it, and they were just forward thinking. And so my sense is that most of the regional, so we're talking about these regional organizations that assist government, and that's largely their role, except in transportation, where they have money, or possibly human services where they have money. And so in this context, it's about how do you start to create dialogue around issues? And some of the interesting examples have been, for instance, affordable housing. So affordable housing is often resisted by communities, and partially they're resisted because they don't want to be the dumping ground of affordable housing as they think about it, right? They want to have, so this whole notion of fair share affordable housing has been in several different jurisdictions or metropolitan areas been mediated out of how that would actually work, right? So issues have to be locally relevant. They have to have some kind of impetus. So in that case, the state of Connecticut, for instance, or the state of Ohio, the number of places that it happened, basically said you had to do something. You had to create a plan. Question is, how did you do that? You also saw these kinds of things around state mandates. For Seattle, for instance, went through a whole planning process, a couple of years long to meet the mandate for growth management to densify neighborhoods. The state required it. The rebellion occurred. Luckily, the mayor was smart enough to say, okay, if you don't like this, you do it. and completely changed the structure of the planning department to neighborhood-based planners, none of which, very few of which had existed before, and got the processes put into the neighborhoods, right? You have the same thing. It's a scale question, but it's also each of those neighborhoods have different needs and things like that. And the issue was, what's the fair share of the density? And then how do you design for it? And they got plans that in fact worked and were implemented, right? So I don't think this happens with the way we do things now. It actually requires moving forward to taking these issues seriously and building the infrastructure necessary to support these kinds of processes. And then those successes can start to lead to rethinking the structures themselves. But without those successes, I don't think you're going anywhere. Are you ready to party? Oh, no. Yes.
I think so. Thank you so much for this. It's really wonderful. I'm just wondering if you could comment on. I think that the Chattanooga experience is really inspiring, and yet I think the context of the early '80s was a moment when the idea of citizen participation, community engagement was still relatively new, sort of coming off of that period of sustained federal support with maximum feasible participation. And I mean, we're now in a context where I think there's quite a lot of disillusionment with community engagement because of people witnessing these processes become routinized, become sterile, become captured by particular groups. And so do you have any thoughts on kind of how we can re-energize both planners, but also community's sense of potential of engagement and participation, and particularly how we can get out of this kind of like overly procedural form of participation that is, essentially just checking a box process?
A very important question. I spent the first more than half of my career during that upward movement of these kinds of processes, and it was exhilarating. And then, somewhere in the mid 2000s, it started becoming more and more difficult to create what I considered the conditions necessary to run one of these processes, because either the community would be disillusioned, or the convener would have a set idea about what should happen. Many of the processes that we have in governance are driven by requirements. The city of Atlanta has a charter. It tells the city what it can do and what it can't do. It's built into a structure. And it is the nature of governance to try to routinize things so that they are not subject to the tensions of creating something new, both in terms of the difficulty of doing that and in terms of the questions it raises. So I think the question is a quite serious one. And so we have been through movements, right? I mean, if you look at social movements just generally through the United States, the labor movement, the kind of activism of the 1960s, which is quite different than the mediation collaborative processes of the 80s and 90s. So we've gone through these cycles. Usually you get a crash in between them, and then you have to rejuvenate them. So ideas about how to do that. Well, I think you really have to be embedded in community to do this. You cannot impose this from the top. So then there's a complete mismatch between the power to make decisions and the community that's seeking voice, as well as the resources necessary to do a good job. And so there were efforts which largely it was the rise of partisanship which undermined these efforts to actually bring some of these processes to Congress. It was brought to a number of state legislatures. Some of those still exist. I think they provide interesting models and experiments I think there's also this thing about trying different things. What made it exciting in the 80s and 90s, as you said, is that it was new and there was energy behind it. I don't think the energy has to go away. You just have to reproduce those kind of conditions, which in a highly partisan situation means that both sides have to want that to happen. So you have to, in fact, again, almost create a dialogue in order to create the conditions necessary to go any further. Is that enough? I don't know. It's probably not.
We can talk about it more.
Okay, we'll talk about it. Yes, we have the rest of my career here. Yes.
Very briefly mentioned digital technology for communication. I'm remembering that in the 70s, Amitai Etzioni talked about the potential for two-way cable television, where the people in their living rooms could respond to what the city was telling them, and how this was going to transform things like urban planning. I'm very curious to hear your take on where we are in transforming these kinds of processes using digital technology and what the future might look like.
I am not a digital optimist. I find that difficult conversations are more difficult in an environment where you're not face to face. That there's a certain level of accountability that comes from engaging with people. That said, clearly you have to be able to scale up, right? But there are ways of scaling up, like the America Peaks processes, that are a combination of face-to-face and digital. The idea of just putting things online, I actually think a significant part of the problems we are in now are come out of the plethora of channels that we have. That it's very hard to have a conversation with people who are different than you are if there are no channels to do that, and all of the channels are between people with similar attitudes. And that's only getting worse, and that is probably significantly also related to both the partisanship and the kind of disillusionment with these processes. And so, I would be looking for mixed systems, thinking about smaller scale, bringing people together in particular scales, and then scaling up. There was for instance, Sweden had a huge fight over nuclear power. And the Swedish government thought, oh, it's because people don't understand what the issues are. So we're going to do these study groups. And they started these processes, sort of 15 people in all these different places all across the nation getting together to try to understand and engage the question of nuclear power. And in the end, after they did that back and forth a bunch, in the end, the citizens said, we do not want nuclear power, which is exactly the opposite of what Sweden expected, the government expected, but they lived with it, right? And so that's a national scale process. They're possible. They take a lot of resources. America Speaks does not exist anymore because it costs so much to do each process. Technology has made that cheaper. It's a lot easier to do what they did now, but nobody's doing it because there aren't any resources to do it, right? To engage people both in a face-to-face, hyper-local, and at the same time, engage them at a much larger scale. We did a process where that was quite interesting. It was public policies, kind of the core of it, where they wanted to look at the question of how kind of the people in community thought about climate change. This is back maybe 12, 15 years ago. And they wanted to do it in a way that was international. So they started it, they had these 8-hour processes. Every city that was involved in this followed the same kind of procedure for how to move through the process. And it started in Japan, which was the first place to get to 8 o'clock in the morning. And then they had 20 or 30 other cities across the world, and each city would report to other cities as well. And there was a whole process of making sure that the individuals you brought together were representative of the community. We paid people to participate. There was a workbook in order to, because you have to structure it in a way. I mean, obviously, any of these processes that are that scale have to have a shared structure that allows them to share results. And it went through the whole world in not 24 hours, because it was 2 times 24 hours before they finally got to the end of it. So that's a scale, and that was 12 years ago. So we can do these things, but they tend to have that mix of technology with face-to-face. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. It's fun hearing it as a current student of yours. I wanted to follow up on Gregory's question about like revitalizing community engagement now compared to where it was like in the early 80s. I know you said or highlighted the importance of being embedded in communities and trying new things that are exciting. But the one aspect that didn't get answered as clearly was reconciling like lack of power and resources in like smaller communities in affecting like planning related processes. So I was wondering if you had any additional follow-up on that specific problem within community engagement of power and resources.
You know, there's a lot of money in, well, planners don't think there's a lot of money in planning, but if you look at the numbers of what goes through planning related work, a lot of money in that. The scale of problems tend to be smaller in small communities. And the number of people tend to be smaller because they're small. And so there's a scaling that happens. And the issue is often, does somebody have the capacity to do that? Somebody in the community or related to the community to actually lead this. So that is partially an education problem. It's a problem of building capacity. It's also a problem of getting people embedded. The way Chattanooga did it is they trained people from the neighborhoods themselves. They had a few key people that were doing that, but they were leveraging it. The work we did in India is about as poor as you can get. It's all leveraged, right? That we hired people from the community. Most of the work was done by people who lived in those communities. Because they lived in those communities, it actually didn't cost very much to hire them, right? But the big issue was training them and building the capacity that way. So the strategies have to be flexible in order to deal with the income and the pre-existing capacities in there. But there certainly have been examples that are about at any scale and any level of income that you can think of. Okay, I think it's probably time to for me to stop at the very least.
Well, I think this is our opportunity to say a few words about Michael, some anecdotes, some funny stories. Well, I'm gonna go first. I don't really have a funny story, but I don't know.
I'm not a very funny person.
Anyway, so well, thank you, Michael, for all you have done. I consider myself very lucky that I got the opportunity to work with you for 4 years. So you are really a pillar of our school. So you're one of the pillars of our school. And I think SCARP is not going to be the same when you leave. So we're dearly going to miss you. You have contributed so much. Michael led the PhD program. You led the master's program, still is leading the master's program. He chaired so many committees at the college level. So your contributions are enormous to Georgia Tech. So we're all going to very much miss you. I tried to buy us a lot of time. I tried to convince him to stay longer and longer, but I wasn't able to, although I still don't have an official resignation. So with that,
I can solve that problem.
There may be still hope, but with that, I think we're going to open it to the floor to say a few words. But before that, I see Bill. But we also have a small art project for Michael's retirement gift. So right behind there where Anna and Jess are standing, so we printed one of the sentimental pictures that where Michael is lecturing on the Beltway. So we have some pens there. So I know that some of you are going to leave soon. Please go ahead, grab a pen, sign the picture, and we'll then give that to you. Hopefully you remember us. Yeah. Okay. So with that, I think Bill was raising his hand.
Need to stand up for a second.
I'm not turning my back on you.
So we heard an hour and 42 minutes on Michael the theorist. I have a brief story on Michael practitioner. And the date, November 30th, 2023. Do you remember that date?
No.
The faculty had been working.
Oh, yes.
Now he remembers. The faculty had been working on special faculty meeting after special faculty meeting after special faculty meeting on a new undergraduate degree. And we had wrestled and wrestled and wrestled and had agreed on the curriculum. However, we did not agree on the name. And in fact, the curriculum process at Georgia Tech is long and onerous and a whole series of meetings. And if you don't get it done by the end of a year, you have to wait an entire year to finish the process. So there's time constraints through the whole thing. So we needed a name for the degree. And after consideration, we thought we have an expert facilitator on our faculty. It might be awkward, though, for him to facilitate his own colleagues. But we went ahead and asked Michael to come in to the meeting. And it was extraordinary when he took control of the meeting and all the faculty in the meeting with our strong opinions. And it was like watching someone, an expert gymnast on a balance beam, who was absolutely confident in what was happening in the process. Or I also thought of a juggler juggling knives, in which every knife, standing for a faculty member, thought
Your death.
that faculty member was the sharpest knife in the drawer. And so Michael was wrangling all of us. And after more than an hour, I'm sad to say, Michael was ready to quit. It didn't seem like we could go further. He took him aside and said, "If we don't get this done, we will have to wait an extra year." And so Michael went back, knocked heads together. Everybody's favorite name got thrown out. Mine got thrown out, Gush's got thrown out. And finally, a name was selected that was not even in the first list of names. And in the second list of names, no one listed it first or even second in their preference. So this name came out of this process. And I'm pleased to report that we went to the Board of Regents, and before the board meeting, I talked to one of the representatives who would introduce our degree. And the board staffer said, "Oh, you won't have any problem getting through. Analytics is in the name, and the Board of Regents loves analytics." So when she introduced the degree, she said, this is a Bachelor of Science degree in urban planning and analytics. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but she did analytics. And when it came up for the time of the degree, it was approved unanimously. And so as of 10:14 yesterday, we have our first undergraduate degree that Michael's facilitation at the crucial moment got it done this year instead of next year or the year after or maybe never. So it was amazing. Display of expertise, of pure skill in wrangling the faculty to this outcome. So thank you. Your portion.
We did to 99% of the rest with several other faculty.
Hey, who else wants to speak? By the way, we have some food at the back. Maybe we can also take the opportunity to walk around, get some food, chat, have more informal conversations.
Do I have to stand again?
About 45 years ago, my PhD advisor in Chapel Hill, Dave Gottschalk, had been to the Netherlands. There you go. Yeah. He had been to the Netherlands where he had worked on a project with Larry Susskind and Mike Kelly. He came back and he said to me, knowing that I was studying citizen participation, he said, you need to meet one of Larry Susskind's PhD students and learn about his work. And that put Mike Elliott on my radar.
I never heard this story.
And so I took every opportunity I could. I eventually got a copy of his PhD thesis. When I was a brand new faculty member at Florida State in the early 80s, I came up here to Atlanta and Mike hosted me. I stayed at his house, and we spent the better part of a day in the Rabbit Warren that was the old city planning offices here. Some of you know that place. And we talked about our mutual interests. And then a few years later, when Florida had just created, I was at Florida State at the time, and Florida had just created what was inelegantly called the Florida Growth Management Conflict Resolution Consortium.
For sure.
At my suggestion, the consortium brought Mike down to train environmental mediators around the state of Florida in their craft. Michael did a wonderful job of that. And then a few years later, we worked together on a project that the Hewlett Foundation funded to advance environmental mediation ideas. And in this process, I came to understand that Michael's default habit, if you questioned him or pressed him or didn't understand what he was saying, his default habit was to get more abstract. and that would happen 2 or 3 iterations until finally he'd get the idea that he needed to come down to earth. And then we make some progress. And I really enjoyed those days. But you know, if you look at the long arc of planning ideas in the West, the ideas you have argued for all these years have come to be the dominant way we think about planning. The communicative turn one out. And certainly in the planning theory world, that's what we think is the way that you ought to be doing planning. And the work I've done at the UN, the ideas that you talked about today are all over the New Urban Agenda that was adopted in 2016. And then I'll quickly come to a close here. I came to Georgia Tech in 2008, and I quickly heard from many of our alumni that the best course they took in graduate school was Michael Elliott's negotiation and conflict.
Yeah.
So certainly. Instead, he directed the PhD program, he directed the master's program, and as a school chair, we think that is
Way up here.
So I'm proud that I partnered with you in recruiting planners and educating planners and helping to build Georgia Tech.
Thank you very much.
I think you were raising your hand.
I was, but just to say something briefly. So I just want to say on behalf of the college, of course, thank you very much for all the work you've done all these years. I was a little worried when you first started off, like the doom and gloom drum executive orders that, oh God, this is supposed to be uplifting, go forward, work planners, take on the world. And so you saved it. You did. Thank you very much. Going to worry about that. But I have to say, I do agree with Kusha that having you retire may not be the best idea. Keep
Somebody.
We have telework policy that we might need you to mediate on at the Institute, if any of you have heard about that. But I do think, you've been invaluable. And I know from somebody who actually went through planning school, not in the height of negotiation, mediation, various students, but having hung out with Tanya Saddle, folks, that work you've done is incredibly transformative, important, and probably, as you heard the applause for the class, the skill set that planners really realize you need. So thank you again. The governor of Maine hires you also to work on her little mediation problem with the Department of District.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm Brian and I'm.
So I'm Catherine Ross. I retired 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Pleasure. Working with you. And as you talked about his elevated level of abstraction, I don't think that's all that it is. What I have found is that he's so determined to negotiate and renegotiate. You get to a point, you say, Michael, tell me what to do.
Okay, so we've heard from some faculty colleagues, and two of us in the room have the distinct pleasure of having been both students and faculty colleagues. So a few things I've learned about Michael in, I guess, about the 25 years we've known each other.
Long time.
Yeah, the first came as a student, so I was here to get my PhD, came a long time ago, and talk about dates. And one of the most distressing parts of that process was to enter in on the first day in Michael's advanced PhD theory class. That's when you're given the syllabus. So you're given the syllabus. I think the version I took, it was 40 pages. It's the longest syllabus I've ever seen. Every week, it's not one, but several books. And so I was sure that either two things were happening. One, you had a very dry sense of humor. That's not the case. Or that it was just missing that word that we all look for, which is optional. Either thing was true. And so we have several of us here that are represented by the mini cohorts, and every one of us has bitched about the syllabus. Every one of us has benefited from going through that process. Michael has very high standards as an academic, and he's brought that into his teaching, and he's brought that to our faculty. So we've had several issues come up over all the years, and those high standards have always guided us. So I've always appreciated that. So I appreciate that.
I'm glad you appreciated it.
Another quick story. As a co-teacher, Michael and I taught the master's level theory class for years. And as part of that, every year we used to, anyway, get on a bus and go around to a tour of Atlanta. So many of you have had that experience. And so for many years, that wasn't just the one Michael, but two. We had Mike Dobbins, and Michael Elliott. And there are not any two bigger brains on the faculty that know more about Atlanta than those two individuals. So we would ride around and could fight every time. Battle for the microphone. Battle for the microphone. One would get it and be telling a story, and you could look at the other one and they'd be there tapping his toe, right? Like, just wanted to add some more details, and the details he was adding was correcting what Mike Dobbins. But I always really enjoyed those tours, and really, Michael is a great storyteller because he retains everything. And so he is very effective at creating narratives in his teaching, and I have always admired that. I don't quite have that capacity that you do to retain all of it and weave it together. We saw some of that tonight. Last quick story. Came into work one day years ago, walked into my office and it was open, unlocked. Usually we lock our door. And walked in, strange, had the door unlocked, and there's a Coke can on the floor in my office. Do you know what it was?
No idea.
Now, Michael, there was a
Oh, yes, I do.
1 year, Michael and Bill were co-chairs of the program. And kind of a transitional year for us. And as a creature of the bureaucracy that we all become, Michael knows that when the bureaucracy coughs up a resource, you never give it up. And so in that position as co-chair, Michael became the skeleton key to every office, which I bet he has right now in his pocket. Never give it up. Bill has it too. And so Michael had been in my office because I've had a little sofa, sleeping after staying up half the night to grade his papers, drinking Coke to enable this process. And Michael is truly, truly dedicated to his teaching those students. Puts a ton of effort into it that you see if you're in the classroom, but you really see it behind the scenes that you've taught with him. And so I always have appreciated that. Michael is an institutionalist. Catherine Ross is an institutionalist for us. Bruce Stiftel was an institutionalist for us. These are our faculty that care so much about the school that they've invested really all that they can to elevate it to where it is today. And so we are going to have a big hole to fill. We're not going to fill it, but this is really a happy time for us to be losing our institutionalist who's had a great time. Thank you.
So I am going to talk about Michael as a
You're getting your award for traveling.
Yeah, I traveled further. Whether about to see there now. So I'm Nisha Bochway. I was a faculty member here about 4 years ago. I met Michael 14 years ago when I interviewed this weekend for an associate professor position. And Michael was on the committee. I remember going out to lunch with you at some place over there. And I ordered fish and chips. And after I ordered that, you probably ordered something like a salad or tacos. Oh man, bad choice. But you always make me feel welcome. I had the distinct honor of being his neighbor for about 6 or 7 years. And we weren't always in the office at the same time. You were there typically in the evenings because you were getting ready for the negotiation class or some other class, but we were also there today. And I remember as I was leaving, often I would see you coming for the second time for the day. And it was just always a pleasure to run into you. You always had a smile on your face, a pleasant word. And then the last thing I'll note is I hear from Michael typically, I mean, it's not 2 or 3 times a year, always at least once a year, and it's always in February. Because there's an event in February that Michael always remembers, no one else remembers it. But Michael always remembers it. And so I wanted to, when I saw Bruce posted this on Facebook, I wanted to make sure I was here to celebrate you in all the ways that you celebrate us. So Michael, thank you.
Thank you. And the thing that I sent her greetings for is the Nisha Bochway Day for Miami, which is an official day in Miami. When you're
Makes sense, yes.
I'm the other person who has the luxury of both having been a student and a colleague with Michael Elliott. I first met Michael in 2011. And I know that it was just about 14 years ago because I had a 6-month-old baby at the time, who is now 14. And I was in his qualitative methods class, which I believe was the first time it was taught. So we were the guinea pigs. Other person in the class was Thomas Duthat, who wants me to give you a hug. I just texted him a picture of your talk. And Stephen Schwan, who's now in Seoul, Korea. And I remember being introduced to excellent, amazing, formative texts like Thomas Kuhn's book on the scientific method, and also Herbert Gans's book on the urban villagers was another just fantastic text that still resonates with me as I think about urban problems today. The thing I really enjoyed about Michael was that I spent my formative years in the Northeast. My undergraduate degree was in the Northeast, and we have a certain way of arguing with one another in the Northeast that I really relish being able to do with Michael. We don't do that all the time here in the South, but with Michael, I just knew that we could speak our minds. The other thing that is truly impressed upon me was when I became faculty, I understood the amount of work, just the hours, the sheer hours it takes to run this place. And there were a couple of people who were doing more than everyone else in terms of putting in that time. And I just deeply appreciated how much, not just love, care, attention, but just the time that it takes to keep this place running, to keep it improving, to build it. And I deeply appreciate that. Above all, Michael has given his. Thank you.
Stories. I was up until 2 o'clock working on this. I'm gonna go get.
Former current teacher. And if you're leaving, please don't forget to sign the poster.
I was about to say.
Whatever, that's a grandbaby.
Oh.